So there are many different issues around disparate impact. The important one right now is criminal history. How many of you have heard that the rules around criminal history changed in the last couple of years? A lot of you. Well, that's good. Pardon me?
The last few months has been some changes.
Well, that might be something I don't know about. This happened a couple of years ago in Washington. Okay. So, so criminal history used to be, until this recent change, that a housing provider could just say, we don't want anyone with criminal history, or we don't take felons. They could have very broad stroke restrictions on criminal history, which obviously created problems for a lot of people who paid their debt to society and can't get housing. It falls under disparate impact because it was tied to race originally. So when you look at the imprisonment rate for African Americans, it's far higher than for whites. Also, who gets in trouble and who doesn't. You know, the difference between crack cocaine and other types of cocaine. There are all these statistics. Does anyone see the movie, the documentary 13 or 13th? Few heads nodding. Anyway, it's on Netflix. That goes into this in a whole lot of detail on why African Americans, and to some degree Latinos as well, are arrested more frequently and are convicted more frequently, and so therefore have criminal records more frequently. The imprisonment rate for African Americans is 6 times higher than whites. 2 to 3 times higher for Latinos. So people were saying, hey, well, it's a huge problem in general, but then when we're looking specifically at housing, who can get into housing, it's obviously, since so many more people of color have these histories, it's going to be more of a barrier. And actually, Oregon has the 7th highest rate in the nation of African Americans incarcerated, which is interesting. We have a very small African American population, 46% higher than the national average. So this is kind of the foundation for this. So in April of 2016, HUD came out with guidance saying criminal history screening policies may have a disparate impact based on race and violate the Fair Housing Act. So here's what this means practically. Even though what brought this forward was issues around race and race discrimination and disparate impact based on race, this change in criminal history always applies. Even if you live in a town where everybody is white, there are no people of color, you still have to follow this. You still cannot have a blanket restriction, no criminal history. But it came out of concern about this issue related to race. That's what brought this forward, was that these policies have a disparate impact on African Americans. So what does this mean in practical terms right now? It means you can't have these blanket restrictions. You can't say no criminal history, no felonies. You have to really look and find out more about what's going on. You can't use arrest records. You just have to use convictions. And when you're looking at felonies, you can't say no felonies. You have to identify which felonies would endanger residents, would endanger property. Those are the things in your screening that you're concerned about. Who here is, by any chance, a member of Multifamily Northwest? A few of you are. I can tell you Multifamily Northwest, which is a property management association, has done a lot of work going through all the different crimes and how to categorize them. So if you're a member and you use their forms, that's a benefit. And there may be some of your companies and organizations may have also done that, but something to be aware of. So now you don't have blanket, you don't have a blanket restriction. You have to look at the situation. What kinds of crimes would be a threat to our property? You need to look at how many convictions are we talking about? When did they happen? Was it 30 years ago? You know, how long ago? You know, it has to be a reasonable look back period. And you're supposed to do an individualized assessment. And this is similar to what Louise was talking about with disabilities. If somebody has a disability and they say, hey, I had this horrible problem with my rental history or my credit history, criminal history, it was caused by a disability, and I want you to accept me as an applicant, even though I don't meet your requirements, as a reasonable accommodation. Please consider me. Well, in that case, you're going to have to look at some information. Oh, I see this person now is getting mental health services, is in recovery. Yes, it looks like their problem was because of a disability. They've turned their life around, and now I don't need to worry about it. So that's just based on disability. Now it's broader, but it's the same idea. Somebody had this criminal history. You do an individualized assessment because they're going to tell you, I've turned my life around. I have a letter from my parole officer. I have my boss, information to show this was a long time ago. Now I'm an upstanding citizen. That's not me anymore. And you would need to consider that information. So it's just like you would do if it's someone with a disability asking for a reasonable accommodation. But with this new criminal history guidance, disability or not, they have the ability to present this information and you to do an individualized assessment and determine whether or not you're going to take them. For those of you who, if you have a company, you have a procedure to do this, it's good for you to have a panel to review these things, so it's not just one person. Hopefully you have a compliance person that you can turn to. There is one exemption where you can always say no, and that's manufacture or distribution of a controlled substance. Okay, so that, yes?
Because it's technically not a reasonable accommodation in this situation, would you say that it's also true that that needs to be initiated by the applicant, or is that something where we get in trouble for saying, well, what we need to do is give us X, Y, Z?
So it's a little bit different because you're going to have to change your criminal history requirements to begin with. Sure. So if you still have the criminal history requirements that were broad, you have to change them and let them know that you would be looking at certain crimes and when they occurred. And then I would tell them, if they're getting that information, when they get that information to you, and say, if there's any supporting documentation you have for us, let us know, and it's going to be a review. Now, if they have, it's really clear, slam dunk, that they've paid their debt to society, it was a long time ago, it's not something that's dangerous, they have support, and you just say, sorry, no criminal history, they could call us. Sure. Just like they could if you denied a reasonable accommodation. So what you have to do now is actually do that individualized assessment. Yep.
Wouldn't that just be on your screening criteria?
Yeah.
As part of your screening.
Yeah, it should be. But be aware they may have additional information they want to give you. But it should be on your screening criteria now. So if you still have screening criteria that says no felonies or no criminal history, you can't do that anymore. The screening criteria would now need to get information about what the crimes were when they happened. Yeah?
I had a question about felony versus misdemeanor. Is that something that could come up, or?
Yeah, really the bottom line, whatever it is it something that would be dangerous or a threat to your property based on what the crime or crimes were. I mentioned multifamily Northwest. Does anybody here work with a company where you have you have already kind of listed out all the crimes and done that? A few of you have, okay. Because that's really helpful to have that to refer to. But even when you have that, again, with the individualized assessment, someone can say, well, here's what I did, here's what it was, but here's what you need to know. And here are these letters from all of these people saying you don't need to worry. Yeah?
So are there similar exemptions for people that are lifetime registered sex offenders?
There is for public housing. But again, it's not spelled out. This is the only one they spelled out. And this comes out of political dialogue. But that's going to come back here. If you have evidence that somebody is presenting a risk, it sounds like they are, they would have a very high threshold to convince you of otherwise. So yeah, that's the only one that's spelled out specifically. Okay. But that would certainly present a red flag for you to review it. And then if based on that you make a determination that you're going to say no, you document why that is, And that makes sense.
Thank you.
Was there somebody else? Okay. Again, this is one of those things, it's when you're in a situation. So I guess the reassurance that I gave you in the beginning, we don't do legal advice, but you can certainly call our office. And if you pick up one of our little booklets, it has the extension you would dial if you want to run a situation by us. And it may be that we can give you some general information that will help clarify that. Okay. Anything else on disparate impact? You guys get what the idea is? What gets this going is if that policy would have more of an impact on a protected class. And again, with criminal history, what got it going was race and national origin, African Americans and Latinos. But it obviously has much broader implications because no matter what the race, religion, or whatever is, you have to observe this. And this is really a very positive thing because a whole lot of folks who paid their debt to society and weren't able to get into housing and have that chance now have it. So 2016 HUD did a number of things. So one of them was this guidance on criminal history. The other one was a ruling on harassment. How many of you have heard about that one? Okay, well, good that I'm here. Okay. So harassment has always been bad and wrong, and that's nothing new. In Oregon state landlord-tenant law, people have the right to peaceful enjoyment of their housing and not being harassed and so on. And the Fair Housing Act has always said that you can't harass, threaten, intimidate, or coerce. But in 2016, there was a new ruling that really kind of delved into harassment. So harassing someone based on protected class violates their civil rights. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, I'm not going to do that. What's being emphasized now is not only you as a housing provider not harassing people or your staff, but you also have a responsibility in case one of your residents is harassing another. And unfortunately, that happens based on protected class. So you are responsible. I have landlord, property management, it would also be a homeowners association if that was the arena, is responsible if this is going on for investigating and taking action if both the person doing the harassment and the person being harassed are your tenants. So we're not talking about somebody who lives on the other side of town. It's where you have authority. They're both your tenants. So I can tell you in the last year, maybe a little more than a year, there's been a dramatic increase in harassment complaints in general. And if any of you ever look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are all these statistics showing how harassment based on race, religion, sexual orientation, and so on have really increased. Immigrants. So 32% of these acts of harassment occur in housing. So we have had an uptick on our hotline in these types of situations. So 1 in every 15 acts of hate are ever reported. So we and other organizations are doing a lot more work now letting people know what their rights are if they're being harassed based on protected class. Now, there's all kinds of harassment that goes on, and you know this really well. It's not just based on protected class. People in your buildings are going to harass each other. You're making too much noise. Her son took my son's bike. His dog pooped on my lawn, right? There's all kinds of things where people are harassing each other. This law is just carving out where it has to do with protected class. Now, sometimes these issues can expand into fair housing issues, where people are mad about one thing and they're yelling and it gets back and forth, and then one of them starts calling the person the N-word, and on it goes. And then it crosses over into fair housing and protected class. And here's an example of that. So this was a situation that took quite a while ago, and it started out as a parking issue. And as you know, parking can be a really passionate issue. Who gets what spot? And in this case, the individuals in this one unit thought they should have gotten this parking spot. that these other people got the parking spot. And they were really angry about that. And people knew they were angry. So the folks who did get the parking spot happened to be Asian. One day they came out of their apartment, and I don't know, did anyone ever see the movie Mulan at some point? Which had a Chinese heroine, a Disney movie. There was a Mulan doll with a rope around its neck hanging right outside their door. Now, what was easy about this one is it was easy to figure out who done it, which is not always the case, okay? But again, it started out parking, blah, 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 and then it crossed over to the fact that these people were Asian. So, there are a variety of ways that people harass each other. A lot of it is words, calling people a variety of names, go back to your country, these kinds of things. Actions, spying, touching, because sexual harassment is in the mix here. Leaving derogatory messages on cards. We've had a couple of instances where people slipped notes under the door. One was, quote, queer, no one's going to protect you anymore. And the other one was something about going back to your own country, we don't want you here. So, of course, now there's social media. Displaying swastikas, sometimes Confederate flags being hung up in front of where there's an African American across the way. In most cases, for it to qualify as a fair housing issue, it's more than one time. It's a pattern of behavior or something really horrendous. It's not like one fight where somebody says something, okay? So, to be alerted on this. So, if you know something like this is happening and you hear about it, under this new ruling, as soon as you know about it, you must take action. Okay, you must start investigating and trying to figure out what's going on. And is it a fair housing issue or not? Again, if it's other issues, noise, you still have to deal with it, but you might do mediation, you may decide to stay out of it. But again, if it's race, religion, sexual orientation, any of these things, you must take action. So the challenge here is many times it's one person's word against another. And there's no corroboration, and there's nothing else. And that's where it gets really hard. And if you don't have corroboration, you can't go after someone. What you can do, though, is you can let the person who's accused know. And you can say, I want to let you know this complaint's happening. I don't have any verification, but I do want to let you know if in the future there is, you're at risk of losing your housing. Okay? This is what, so you can always just share that information. So again, if the harassment isn't based on a protected class, your dog's pooping here, you're too much noise, you have some flexibility in how you proceed. You may do mediation, you may have consequences for both parties. You can kind of come up with whatever strategies you want. But if it's a fair housing issue, there are some things you have to do, and it's now falling under federal law. And again, this includes sexual harassment too. One resident sexually harassing another, peeping in their windows, all kinds of stuff. So these are some examples of situations we've had in our office, just to give you an idea, or that we've heard about in some cases. Mentioned sexual harassment. This was a case in a mobile home park. There was a lesbian couple. The neighbors, these neighbors of theirs, would shout all these terrible things at them whenever they saw them related to their sexual orientation, and they would leave dog feces on their porch. Okay? And so the issue here, here's where fair housing kicks in, is the couple went to the manager of the park, and the manager did nothing. That is the headline. So the headline out of all of this is do not do nothing. Investigate, take action if you get evidence, document that, but do not ignore it. This was another ignoring situation. This was in Washington County. There was a gentleman, a gay gentleman, and his elderly mother who lived in the downstairs unit, and there were these kind of Yahoo guys upstairs that would harass him based on his sexual orientation. They would yell things in the summertime through his window, terrorizing his mother. They also would urinate on his front door, which I would think would upset management right there, because I know that's got to be bad for the paint, right? But management did nothing. So once again, the management, didn't do anything. So the complaint is filed against the management. This was a retirement community where there was a woman who had an assistance animal for anxiety, and the neighbors didn't like that she had the animal, and they were harassing her to the point where she was afraid to come out of her apartment. This was not in Oregon. It was $160,000. This was in a condo. The man had a traumatic brain injury. He'd been in a car accident. So his speech and his hearing were impaired, and the neighbors would yell things at him and make fun of him. They called him, quote, retard, pervert. He would use the pool, and the kids would steal his clothes and his shoes and taunt him. Went on and on. He and his family complained to the HOA and to the property. There was a community manager that was hired repeatedly over months, and nothing happened. So again, that's the headline. If you hear about something like this, you have to take action. This was also not in Oregon, $550,000. Intense, ongoing racial and sexual harassment. It was also in a condo, including, quote, I'll see you in the backyard hanging from a tree. So basically, if you hear of something like this, you investigate, you document. If it's not a fair housing issue, you have more flexibility in terms of how you're going to address it. If it is a fair housing issue, if you've verified it's happening, you must take prompt corrective action. Depending on what it is, a warning, or giving them a notice. How you deal with it may vary. There was one situation where an individual hung swastika curtains up in his apartment facing out. And what the management did in that situation is they just sent a notice to all the tenants saying that they had to use the blinds that came with their unit. So, they aren't exactly telling you what to do, but you have to end the problem. And document it, and then follow up with the victim to make sure things have resolved. If you do nothing, that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. So one thing I put some on the table there if you're interested, is a sample harassment policy, because you may just have a generic rental agreement where it says all federal laws, but somebody may need to know if they are harassing their neighbors, they're at risk of losing their housing. That it's a violation of federal law and you need to do something. So I did bring a sample policy that many providers are using in case you want to use it. If you have newsletters, there's things you can do to just educate people so they know what they can and can't do. These are some quotes from the actual HUD ruling. I usually don't do a lot of legalese stuff, but I pulled out a few just to kind of emphasize it. So you have to do something. If you've determined this is going on, harassment, threats, intimidation, based on protected class, you must take corrective action. So depending on what it is, it may just be a warning that you document and see what happens, enforcing lease provisions to move, evict, or otherwise sanction tenants who harass or permit their guests to harass. Housing providers should follow up to make sure the corrective action was effective. Is the problem ended? Is this person done harassing you? Liability arises when you knew or you should have known that the resident was harassing another resident, and yet did not take prompt action to correct or end it. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, any questions? We'll have a few scenarios later that deal with some of the challenges that can come up here. But the bottom line here, the headline is, if you hear about it, harassment based on protected class, you're not doing it, but somebody else is doing it to one resident to another. Once you know about it, you have to take action. Obviously, if you find out any of your employees are doing it, then you're got to make sure that doesn't happen.